We always start at the Monroe County Public Library. It's actually the first public library in the state of Florida. It's home to the books of so many writers that have lived down here. 12 Pulitzer Prize winners have called it home. That's more per capita than any town in the United States. And to kind of speak to, I think, our most famous writer, the Key West Library actually has a really special place in his story too. Agnes von Kurowski, who I think is even more interesting. She was a librarian, and she was the inspiration for the character of Catherine in Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, which was one of his most famous works. And she's sort of the tragic heroine, the nurse that's featured in it that, spoiler alert, dies at the end. But that was based on this actual woman who was a nurse that nursed young Hemingway back to health during World War I when he was an ambulance driver. And weirdly, years later, their paths converge, and she was a librarian here when he and Pauline, his second wife, lived here. So our first stop's down on Williams Street. It's Shel Silverstein's old place, the poet and children's book writer that lived here in the 80s and 90s. It's this really cool wood cottage where he did most of his writing, most of his business correspondences, and so forth. He did finish A Light in the Attic down here, and certainly wrote a number of other poems, songs, and he was a pretty prolific songwriter. Most people don't know he wrote Boy Named Sue for Johnny Cash. He won a Grammy for it. He didn't own a house here when he published Where the Sidewalk Ends, but the writing in that poem, there is a place where the sidewalk ends and before the street begins, and there the grass grows soft and white, and there the sun burns crimson bright. I think that you see sort of these moods or these images or moments of inspiration that I think must have been drawn from the town here, especially with the magic of it. So you see that directly and indirectly. This is the Key West Writers Compound at Windor Village. I love the relationship between Ellison and Hersey in particular. Ellison, of course, best known for his fiction, Invisible Man, which is really about the violence and invisibility of being a black man in pre-integration US. And John Hersey, who had written about World War II, really put himself on the map with the Pulitzer as a war journalist. When they moved down here, interestingly, they encouraged each other to switch genres. You'd be amazed at how many of these kind of compounds are hidden behind gates. Books and Books is Judy Blume and her husband George Cooper's bookshop. They opened in 2014 and have been here since. Growing up reading her work, Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, Tiger Eyes, Super Fudge. My personal favorite, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. And we look back on those books and think of them as being relatively innocent in subject matter, at least I know I do. But Ms. Blume has been both one of the most prolific writers to have ever called Key West home. She's sold, I believe, over 85 million copies of her books worldwide, translated into tons of different languages. She's also one of the most censored. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret has been censored from a number of US libraries, public schools, and so forth. So she's become an outspoken critic of censorship and has written essays about intellectual freedom. It's a really special place. Casa Antigua is actually the site of Hemingway and his then-wife Pauline's first apartment in Key West. Now, the two of them were coming from Paris, where they'd been living as expats. He had just published his first novel, The Sun Also Rises, which was met with international critical acclaim and really put him on the map as a young literary superstar. So they rented one of these second balcony rooms, and this is the apartment where he first started writing A Farewell to Arms. They ultimately found the house over on Whitehead Street, which they called home for a number of years after, and where Hemingway wrote some of his most famous novels. Then we have this wonderful new generation of writers, Judy Blume and Meg Cabot and Annie Dillard and Ann Beattie, women writers that are down here. And I think it's fascinating to have this new period after the legacy in the 70s of the guys chasing Hemingway's ghost, Hunter S. Thompson, Tom McGuane. I think it's wonderful that we have this cohort of women writers down here after our history of sort of these masculine writers.